In the first millennium BCE, an epic poem swept across the Fertile Crescent, taking the region by storm. The poem contains a description of a great flood caused by the gods, which brought about widespread destruction and the subsequent rebuilding by the survivors. So popular was this epic that it was copied and widely distributed, appearing in major archaeological sites among some of the greatest centers of civilization in the region, such as Babylon, Nineveh, Assur, and Ur, the supposed birthplace of Abraham. In fact, this poem was so popular that copies of it discovered at those locations outnumber even that of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This epic would come to be known as the poem of Erra. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. Before we can get started on the Tower of Babel, our next myth in the series, we must first conclude the story of Noah that we covered in the last episode. I saved the ending of the Noah story because it plays a role in the Tower myth, which I'll explain later. We pick up the thread in Genesis chapter 9, verse 18, when Noah and his family exit the ark. We're told his sons are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But then something odd occurs, the mention of Canaan, which is Ham's son. We see in verse 19 that the inclusion of Canaan was an addition, as the text reads, "These three were the sons of Noah, and from them the whole earth was populated." None of the sons of the other children are mentioned, nor any descendants of Ham. Only Canaan, which was mentioned here to bring the total of the descendants from 3 to 4, the importance of which will become clear later. Noah, who is called a man of the soil, meaning he's a farmer, is said to be the first to plant a vineyard. This doesn't make sense if read after a pair of creation stories and the subsequent stories involving Cain and Abel, the shepherd and the farmer. Also, chapter 2, verse 29 claims that Noah will save them from the toil of being farmers. But it does make sense if, originally, Noah was meant to be the primordial man. You see, the story of Adam was one myth of the first man, a myth from the Edomites. Meanwhile, the story of Noah was a separate myth of the first man who arrives on earth after the waters were defeated by the gods. Though his name wasn't Noah, it was Enoch, as we covered previously. And we might also be dealing with fragments from another Noah character who had nothing at all to do with a flood, but begins by introducing Noah with a genealogy and then proceeds with the story of his curse. This story serves as an etiological tale for the origins of winemaking, and as a justification for taking their fellow countrymen, the Canaanites, as slaves. In that story, Noah isn't a great boat builder, but a farmer, who enslaves his neighbors, the Canaanites, and has them work the fields, thus saving his people from the hard labor of farming. So Noah grows a crop of grapes and gets drunk off the wine. He gets naked and passes out in his tent. At this point, Ham discovers him, and again we have an insertion in the text to remind us that Ham is the father of Canaan. The editor of the story needs a fourth descendant in order to adapt an older myth, and needs this addition to be the subject of the upcoming curse to make that happen. Noah's other two sons, Shem and Japheth, cover their naked father with a robe. Then we encounter something strange as Noah wakes up and sees what Ham had done to him. So he places a curse on Ham's son, Canaan, so that his descendants would be slaves. So what exactly is going on here? First, if the story was about Noah just being naked, then he wouldn't have had much of a reaction upon waking, because the only thing noticeable in the current version of the story is the presence of the robe, which was placed on him by Shem and Japheth. But he noticed something that Ham had done, so there's a missing piece to be discovered. And one clue is in the curse. Noah doesn't curse Ham, the perpetrator of the missing act, but his progeny, Canaan, who is to become the father of the Canaanites. Often in biblical literature, the punishment fits the crime, so the crime of Ham has to do with reproduction. The second clue is in Noah's nudity. Ham finds him naked, but does something which goes unstated, and then Noah discovers it upon waking when he looks beneath the robe. It's not difficult to imagine that the crime against Noah was castration. This would explain Noah's reaction. He could no longer produce children, so he cursed the child of the culprit. But to fully understand the background of the story, we have to look to a widely known myth in the region, that of several Titan brothers usurping their father Uranus. In the myth, the sons of Uranus castrate and dethrone their father, just as the sons of El Elyon attempt to usurp the high god of the Hebrew pantheon, and are thus cast down before having sex with the women of earth to create the Nephilim, and invite the great deluge which kick-started this whole story. The evidence is in the names of Noah's sons. Japheth is an alternate spelling of Iapetus, one of the offenders in the Uranus myth. And Cronus, the Titan who wielded the sickle and actually did the deed, he's identified with the Carthaginians, who follow Baal Haman, where we get the name Ham, whose vicious act earns him Noah's scorn. So why is Canaan included? Originally, he was only another brother in the story who helped hold down the drunken father, while Ham wielded the knife or the sickle. Then the authors repurposed the myth to serve as a table to legitimize taking Canaanites as slaves, so Canaan became the progeny of the man who committed the act, to serve as a stand-in for the nation. As for the other brothers, they received blessings and became the progenitors of the Israelites. In verse 26, we find, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be his slave, and may El expand Japheth, and may he dwell among the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." This odd little bit also mentions Yahweh of Shem, which is only one version of Yahweh mentioned in the Bible. There will be many more Yahwehs who will later be merged into a single Yahweh. As for Shem, he's no longer a son who violates his father, but preserves what little dignity he has left. For that, he becomes the progenitor of the Elamites, Arameans, and Abraham himself. This leaves us with two questions. First, why would the Israelites need justification to take slaves from among the Canaanites? Second, why would Noah's son wish to castrate their father? Both have rather simple answers. According to their law code, one cannot take slaves from their own people, but gathering slaves from another nation is perfectly acceptable, so no such justification is needed, until we realize that the Israelites were Canaanites. They weren't ethnically different. They were religiously different. Canaanites was a term that the Hebrew people used against their fellow countrymen to distance themselves from people who didn't practice their religion in the same manner, even when they were worshiping the same God, as many of them were fellow Yahwists. As for the second question, the sons of Noah castrated their father because their mother was either barren or dead. You see, Noah could no longer have children with his wife, who is unnamed in the biblical version of the story, but is called Naamah in Genesis Rabbah, or Amzara in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So his plan was to sleep with the wives of his 4 sons to repopulate the earth. His sons conspire against him, rise up, and put an end to Noah's scheme. He then curses his children, saving the worst for the one who did the deed. This was then rewritten in stages until we end up with the tale that we have today. Chapter 10 begins with the Table of Nations, which serves as the conclusion to the story of Noah. There's a great catastrophe that ends with a list of descendants who go out into the world to populate it, each serving as the progenitor to another people or nation, each with their own language. These genealogical additions are common in the Hebrew Bible and are often contributions from the priestly source, a group of Zadokite scribes who inserted genealogies in order to link contemporary figures and groups with prominent figures from their history, who were often legendary. They also contributed details concerning priestly practices within the Jerusalem temple. These additions are often tedious and boring, but even then we can find juicy tidbits to examine. For example, in the list of descendants for Japheth, we find Madai, who is said to be the progenitor of the Medes, an Iranian empire that would later be absorbed into the Persian Empire. Another of his sons is Javan, the father of the Greeks, and Magog, the land to the north along the Black Sea. This is common in ancient literature, ideological tales for the origins of a nation which claim the entire people are descended from a single individual whose name will later be used for that nation. We'll encounter this later when a man named Israel fathers the entirety of the Israelites through his 12 sons, who in turn fathered the 12 tribes of Israel. The entire list, known as the Table of Nations, is meant to serve as an ideological tale for the nations of the world, as known to the authors in their time. Each descendant of Noah goes on to found a nation, and each of those nations had their own language. And one detail of note before moving on from this chapter is a particular descendant of Ham. His eldest son, Cush, became the father of a man named Nimrod, who is said to be a mighty hunter in verse 9, and was king of Babylon, Erech, and Akkad. Erech is the city Uruk, the home of the legendary Gilgamesh, and Akkad is the home of Sargon, the world's first emperor. Here, Nimrod sounds like another conqueror going forth from his city-state to add to his expanding empire, eventually bringing Assyria under his control and building the city of Nineveh. Nimrod deserves an episode on his own, but suffice it to say he was believed to be a demigod on par with Gilgamesh or Hercules. In Hebrew mythology, he is linked with Orion. According to legend, he tried to have Abraham killed at birth, similar to the Moses story. He battled Esau immediately prior to Esau trading away his birthright for a bowl of lentil stew, as we'll later see when covering the story of Jacob. And finally, he was said to be the king who ordered the construction of the Tower of Babel. According to one midrash, he constructed a grand pyramid with an enormous gem at its summit. In other sources, he was said to have raised up the tower in an attempt to keep himself safe in the event of another deluge, making the Tower of Babel a sort of ark to preserve life from Yahweh's wrath. But that's not all. Nimrod planned to use the tower to assault the heavens and depose the gods themselves. They fired arrows into heaven, but Yahweh's angels caught them, dipped them in blood, and tossed them back down to convince the archers that they had slain the heavenly host. This is why their language was confused. Before we conclude Chapter 10, we must confront an inconvenient detail in the Table of Nations. The descendants of Noah are meant to represent various nations that inhabited the world. Of course, the list of nations is far from complete, despite the claim that this is where all of the people of the world originated from. There are none of the myriad nations of the Far East, or even the Indus Valley, nor the majority of groups that inhabited the vast continent of Africa. The nations represented here by the descendants of Noah are not only limited, but the identities of them gives us a glimpse into the world of the author, and it's a world not nearly as ancient as the biblical literalists might hope. The names and groupings of the descendants corresponds to the nations and circumstances that can be found in the ancient Near East after the Babylonian exile. As Russell Gamirkan demonstrates in Chapter 6 of his book Berosus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus, the groupings of nations seems concerned with the circumstances of the region long after the events of Genesis. The nations listed and how they are divided up among the children of Noah and their regions closely match up the division of Alexander's empire among his generals following his death. This would place the composition of the Table of Nations sometime after 320 BCE. The Table of Nations and Chapter 10 ends by stating that all these descendants established the clans of the world, each with their own nation and their own language, as humanity branched out following the flood, which completely contradicts the opening line of Chapter 11, which reads, "The whole world had the same language and the same words." Whoops! It appears that the author of Chapter 11 wasn't aware of Chapter 10, so we end up with this little contradiction. This also contradicts Deuteronomy 32, in which El Elyon counts his sons and divides the world into 70 nations, so that each son can have his own nation, giving Israel to his favorite son Yahweh. This story is similar to the Table of Nations of the previous chapter in other ways as well. For instance, it too describes the spread of humanity over the earth in verse 2. The people moved east to the valley of Shinar, which is in southern Mesopotamia, And since they reach this area by traveling east, they're imagined to be coming from the author's home, that of Judah. Next comes the sudden idea to begin constructing a city, which surrounds a tower that will eventually reach into the sky. This is similar to Cain migrating east from Eden before suddenly constructing a city. The unnamed migratory people say they must do this in order to make a name for themselves, lest they become scattered all over the earth, which is ironic considering the outcome of the project. Also, this seems to be motivation behind much of the Hebrew Bible, the desire to forge a unifying identity for a scattered people. It was a driving force of the post-exilic period, as the people of Judah had been dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world and Mesopotamia. In verse 5, Yahweh descends from the heavens to see the city and the tower that these people had built. Seeing the magnitude of the city and the tower that reached into the heavens, Yahweh expresses concern over their potential, saying, "If now, while they are one people and all have the same language, they have started to do this, nothing they presume to do will be out of their reach." So the decision is made to go down to the city and confuse their language, forcing them to halt construction and scatter the people across the face of the world. This is why the city is now called Babel, because Yahweh confused their speech. Let's unpack this section. First, Yahweh expresses fear at the potential of humanity when they work together. This mirrors his concern in the Eden story when humanity discovers divine knowledge, and he worries they could become like the gods themselves if they also ate of the tree of life. Now that man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, what if he should stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever? This is the same fear present in chapter 11, humanity's potential to become more than simple slaves to the gods as they were created to be. Now they're building cities and towers in an attempt to return to the heavens, just as they once attempted to achieve divinity by stealing divine food. And when we recall that in the Nimrod version of the story, this was built as a siege tower to attack heaven itself, that fear becomes more palpable. And the punishment mirrors that of the Eden story. The people are cast out of their home and sent into the broader world, and just as the residents of Eden had an easy life with readily available food, had to now toil under the blistering sun just for scraps, so too did the residents of Babel, who had a splendid city and a single language, are now sent to wander as they're dispersed and have their unified identity and language fragmented. The details that defined both the Eden group and the Babel group are reversed in order to punish the humans for attempting to live up to their potential, rather than accept their role as servants of the gods. And speaking of gods, we likewise see a return to the references of polytheism in verse 7, just as we saw it in the Eden story, when Yahweh expressed fear that humanity had almost become like the gods. He says to the rest of the heavenly host, "Come, let us go down there and confuse their language," mentioning the other gods which Yahweh leads. And the confusion of the language is used as an etiological tale for the naming of Babylon. In the story, it's called Babel. What's being done here is a slight modification of the name to change it from Bab-ili, meaning gate of God, to something that sounds closer to Balal, meaning he confused. What follows is a section which resembles that of the Table of Nations, though it focuses on Shem instead of all the sons of Noah. Each of Shem's children are listed, followed by a list of further descendants who then go out from there to form the nations of the world. But this leaves us with a question that was raised at the beginning of the story. Who are these people? Well, the builders of the Tower of Babel are supposed to be the descendants of Shem. And how do we know this? Because the descendants of Shem are said to be the ancestors of the Mesopotamian nations, like Elam, Asher, and Aram. And the genealogy presented at the end of the story, which tracks Shem's line, leads to Abraham, who, according to verse 31, is from the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, an ethnic group that was part of the Babylonian Empire. But in answering this question, we find a curious parallel to the story of Noah's flood. So let's examine that. In Genesis chapter 6, humanity is growing and multiplying across the face of the earth. During this period, according to chapter 4, verse 17, the people are building cities and accomplishing great things. Also, they all speak a single language. But then trouble arises. In chapter 6, verse 2, the natural order is transgressed as lesser gods depart the heaven and travel down to earth, threatening to mix the natural and the supernatural, which was the same problem seen in Eden when humanity discovered divine knowledge. We find this in the Babel story as well, but the transgression occurs in the opposite direction as the Noah story, with humanity attempting to ascend into the heavens rather than the sons of El Elyon descending down to earth. In both instances, Yahweh's wrath is swift, though it's noticeably less destructive in chapter 11 than in the Noah story. The end result, however, is the same. The natural order, which was established in Genesis 1 creation account, is preserved, and the divisions between heaven and earth is maintained, and the offenders are prevented from making such an attempt in the future. In the Noah story, they're all killed. In the Babel story, their language is confused and they're scattered. But in both stories, their punishment is a reversal of their pursuits. The goal of the sons of God in Genesis 6 was to be fruitful and multiply across the face of the earth, and the result was that they were extinguished. The goal of the residents of Babel was to use their potential granted to them by the virtue of a great number and having a single language to reach the heavens, and the result was for their identity and language to be fragmented. Finally, both stories conclude with the descendants of the characters going out into the world to establish the nations and languages that are known to the authors at the time of the writing. Now, this isn't to say that the Babel story is a variant of the flood story. It isn't. They're inspired by different stories, and we'll get to that in a moment. But these similarities highlight how ancient authors utilized myth. These stories mirror one another because they were both used to serve the same purpose, to reinforce the idea that the divine creation must be maintained, to warn against such transgressions of the natural order, and as ideological tales for the multitude of ethnic groups and languages that they encountered. This is why we find similar stories around the globe which originated by cultures with zero contact with one another. It's human nature. We seek explanations for the things we encounter, and when those explanations escape us, we invent stories to fill these gaps in our knowledge. Here, two vastly different stories were both adapted to fill the same knowledge gap. And stories like this weren't unique to Hebrew mythology. Hecataeus of Abdera recorded an Egyptian myth in which prominent men set out from Egypt and established civilizations all across the Mediterranean world, including Greece and Judea. Like the story of Noah and Babel, it was their way of explaining where all these other nations came from, and also imagining that they were all descendants from their own land, just as the Hebrew authors imagined the entirety of the world being lesser descendants of the Jews. And it should be noted here that this Egyptian ideological tale for the other nations that imagined the people of Judah being Egyptians had its colonizing efforts in the land led by a man named Moses, who founded the city of Jerusalem, divided the nation into 12 tribes, and instituted an Egyptian-based law code. And it seems this ideological tale was older than the one found in the book of Exodus. But we're not going to leave this story just yet. There exists an elaboration on the story from a Hebrew author known as Pseudo-Eponymus, who states that the city of Babylon was founded by giants, who helped construct the great ziggurat. This would mirror the myth of the Nephilim and the idea that Nimrod was one such demigod. It also states that Abraham was a descendant of these giants and learned astrology from the Babylonians before bringing his divine knowledge to the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. The giant who constructed the Tower of Babel in this version of the tale was named Belus, another name for Bel-Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, who was later euhemerized, meaning he was imagined to have been a historical figure, who was the founder of the city and also its king. But where did this story come from, and why is it important? To answer this, we must turn to the ancient stories that the Israelites were familiar with during the time in which Genesis was being written, notably to the poem of Erra of Babylon. According to Babylonian mythology, Marduk allowed the great flood to destroy the world. But Ziusudra buried clay tablets containing the secrets of astrology at the city of Sippur, which was spared from the flood. Remember from the previous episode that Ziusudra was one of the mythical figures to inspire the tale of Noah, and this detail, that of the flood hero hiding a secret text in the one place that was spared by the flood, will become important later on. After this catastrophic flood, the city of Babylon and its temple atop the ziggurat to Marduk were rebuilt. This is the construction of the city and tower seen in Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. However, according to the poem, no one in the newly constructed city could make a suitable idol for Marduk. So he went personally into the underworld to meet with the Apkallu, who were 7 wise sages. They alone could make an idol worthy of the great deity and the patron god of Babylon. During Marduk's absence, Erra, the god of destruction, was left in charge of the world and brought a second catastrophic flood along with mighty storms against the world, which destroyed Babylon and even Sippur, halting construction on the mighty city. But Marduk, the storm god, soon returned, once again bringing order to the flooded and chaotic world so that Babylon could be rebuilt. This pattern of the city of Babylon and its central ziggurat being constructed by survivors of the first flood, only to have construction halted by a second catastrophe, is mirrored in the Genesis narrative. But there are 2 notable differences. In the Genesis version, Babylon does not suffer a second flood, and their catastrophe involves a confusion of languages. These 2 details are additions by the biblical authors, and the reasoning behind them is quite apparent. The authors couldn't have Babylon destroyed by another flood as it occurred in the poem of Erra because of how they chose to conclude the Noah story. In chapter 9, verse 11, the Hebrew God makes a covenant with Noah to never again flood the world. This is repeated in verse 15. The presence of 2 separate flood stories already caused headaches for the editors of Genesis, as their God flooded the world and promised to never repeat the vicious act, only for another version of the story to immediately follow, which too ends with this same promise. This is why the 2 stories were dissected and then reassembled in such a clumsy fashion, to obscure the fact that both versions were included. So after that mess, they couldn't have a second, or rather a third, flood come along to upset all the work they had done. So the catastrophe which halts construction on Babylon and its central ziggurat could no longer be a flood. So why did they choose to use a confusion of languages as the catastrophe? There are several reasons for this. First, the name of the city was already similar to the Hebrew word for he confuses, so the pun was right there for them to pick up. Adopting this reason, and the slight alteration to the name, allowed the story to also serve as an ideological tale, which the Hebrew authors love. A second reason is that a multitude of languages and an incomplete ziggurat reminded them of their time in Babylon. You see, prior to the Babylonian exile, when many of the ruling class was deported from Jerusalem and transported to the home of their conquerors, Babylon had suffered a devastating civil war which partially destroyed the ziggurat. Later renovations were being conducted to restore the impressive monument, and it's likely that many exiled Jews were conscripted for the task. So the idea that people who came from Judah were involved in the temple's construction might have been inspired by actual events, albeit many centuries after the tower's story ostensibly occurred. But during their time there, they would have been exposed to the multitude of languages which were spoken in the Babylonian Empire. No longer were they surrounded by speakers of Semitic languages, which shared so much grammar. Now they were inundated with speech that was truly alien to them. And many words and ideas from this exposure would be taken back to Judah when they returned generations later. Finally, there's the moral of the story, which we find in Genesis 11 verses 4 through 9. The Babylonians, according to the story, wished to forge for themselves a singular identity to prevent themselves from being scattered across the earth. But because they had defied Yahweh, they suffered the fate they most feared. He turned their ambitions against them and scattered them anyway, and caused them to speak different languages, those of the various nations where they settled. This has nothing to do with Babylon. This is the author projecting the fate of Judah during the post-exilic period. Following the destruction of Judah, the residents of the land were scattered throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, as far away as Mesopotamia, where this story takes place. The Jewish people, who were not yet really known as Jews, were fragmented, and many no longer spoke their native tongue. This required the translation of their most important text, such as the scriptures, into other languages, most notably Greek, which was one of the most common languages spoken by the followers of Yahweh. So they weren't talking about Babylon. Not really. They were speaking of their own fate in the wake of the destruction of Jerusalem. The dispersal of the Babylonians in chapter 11 is actually a reference to the diaspora, which saw their people flung to the four winds, settling among foreign peoples and adopting their customs, languages, and even religious practices. It's a cautionary tale concerning what happened and what could happen to them again. But their hope was that messages such as this would do the opposite, that the fate of this fictional group of Shinar construction workers would inspire the reverse to happen with the post-exilic community. That the hope voiced in chapter 11, verse 4, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky, and so make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered all over the earth," would be realized, not in Babylon, but in Jerusalem. Oh, and one more thing before we wrap up. Remember the Apkallu, those 7 sages that Marduk visited, and the storing of the secrets of astrology in the city of Sippor so the sacred knowledge could escape the flood? Well, one of those wise sages was the legendary King Adapa, whose name was preserved in the Sumerian Kings list. And that king served as inspiration for the character of Enoch, who, according to Hebrew mythology, gave the secrets of astrology to Noah to be preserved in the ark so they wouldn't be destroyed by the great flood. And this secret of astrology, according to a Jewish author known as Pseudo-Apollonius, would be picked up by a Babylonian man and later taught to the Hebrew people, as well as the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. And that man was a Babylonian hero descended from the same giants who built the ziggurat, a man named Abraham. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsofgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.